Hey, welcome back to another SSR project video. So in the last video you saw me working on a bunch of stuff on the rear end of the bike, the luggage rack, tail light, turn signals, etc. Now I want to focus more on the front end of the bike. One of the major things I want to take care of is to see if I can stiffen up the front suspension a bit because it's very soft. I also want to mount the headlight, turn signals, etc. I may replace the tire while I'm up here messing with this stuff. Not exactly sure what I'll get into other than I definitely want to do the headlight and turn signals and front suspension. Before I go any further, I want to try something. So this is the stock speedometer sending unit. And it's a geared unit, it turns a speedometer cable. But I don't need a setup like this anymore because I'll be switching to a Trailtech Vapor. What I do still need is a spacer between the wheel and the shock. And you can see there's a spacer built into this. Sometimes you can press that out and it's not too difficult, and that way you don't have to make or buy a spacer. So I'm going to see if that will press out before I attempt to make anything myself. And you can see you can just dump the gears and the washer right out of there. I'm not sure if this is my punishment for working on a 4-stroke or what's happening, but it seems like every video about this thing, one of my tools fails. So of course now my 12-ton press has failed, or at least needs service, because it sounds like it's leaking. I can't get any pressure into it. So rather than mess with that right now, I'm going to try another way. I've got a large socket I'm going to put over this end to try and catch this if it presses out, and I'll be using this to try and force this out of the sender there. We'll see if that works in the vise or not. No, that's not going to go. Alright, fine, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. And that way, I can put it in the lathe and clean it up, but I don't have to totally build a spacer. There's how the spacer turned out. But as I was happy about that, I went over here to the wheel and then realized I really should have paid more attention before I wasted my time on that, because this thing uses a giant 50mm outside diameter seal with a 40mm inside diameter. I went and checked on what I could source for seals, and I would need to have at least a 22mm inside diameter spacer to source one fairly cheap. So I've went ahead and ordered one, a 22 by 50 by 7 I believe it is, but this thing is 17 3/4mm right now. So that won't work in there. I'll save it. It may come in handy for something else. But yeah, so I've got another seal ordered, and I'll have to make a spacer anyway. But while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and pop this seal out of here. And then I can remove the rest of the speedometer stuff. I also need to check my bearings, because I will probably go ahead and replace those. Even though they don't really seem that bad, I think I'm just going to do it while I'm here. And that is a 6301 2RS, so I'll need to get those ordered as well. Well, it looks like having the wheel up on the workbench got me a little bit sidetracked, so while I'm at it, I might as well go ahead and remove the tire and the inner tube. That way I can replace those later as well. went with Michelin City Pros for both the front and rear tires. 225/17 on the front, just like stock. I'll use 250/17 on the back when I get there, just like stock. I've generally had no problems with Michelin tires. I like them. And these things are rated at 93 miles per hour, so way faster than I'll ever go on this. I've still got the spacer on my mind, so I'm just going to go ahead and make that and get it out of the way. There we go. That should be a working spacer. And if you're wondering about the smaller end section, that's because I want it to interact only with the center section of the wheel bearing. Before I disassemble anything else, I want to figure out how to mount the headlight and the turn signals to the front of this moped. And I've got this headlight bucket that fits the headlight that I have, and it does come with its own brackets or mounts, but I'm thinking these are probably too large to even fit the very small stanchion tubes on this moped, so I've got to find that out first. Yeah, even in the smallest slot, they aren't even close to fitting, way too big, so I'm going to have to come up with something else. I've got some steel tubing that fits over these, and it isn't too much larger outside diameter than what was on there. And I've also got these rubber bushings or whatever that were on their stock. They're not a snug fit inside of there, but they're not a bad fit. And what I'm thinking is maybe I can slide those all the way down as far as I can, and then put these tubes on, and perhaps cut the tubes so that they're being squeezed a little bit when I put that top plate on. I don't want them to be squeezed so much that they affect anything else with the suspension, but maybe just enough to keep them in place. And if I make two of those, then I can put whatever bracket I want on here and make it secure instead of the flimsy one that I had before. And just in case I didn't show you very well before, this is really flimsy. It feels like I could break this off. It's very thin gauge steel. And it would probably work, but I just don't like the idea of that. I stuck the plate back in place, and now I'm going to try and get a measurement from the underside of the plate down to the top surface of this bushing. That was just a little shy of 8 inches, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this to about 8 inches, and then that way I can trim it as needed and find out if this is going to work or not. After a bunch of checking and cutting, and then checking, cutting again, and so on, I've got it so that I can't slide it up and down. You can see that it's snug against this plate as well as this rubber piece down here. but it's still loose enough that I can turn it around. And that's without the bolt in there. Once the bolt's tightened up, you can see there's a little bit of play in there, so it's not incredibly rigid, but I think that will be pretty good for what I want to do with it. It's fairly similar to what was on there stock. So now I just need to repeat this for the other side. Now you can see that with it tightened down, I've still got some play in both of these. They're not totally locked in place. Now I've got to figure out how to mount the headlight housing to these. So it's just got bolts that go on the side to mount it, simple enough. And the width of it is actually pretty good for these. I'm going to have to make some sort of tab to make the headlight come out. I've got to figure out how much I want it to come out from these, how far I want it to set forward. And I also need to figure out if my turn signal is going to be on the tab for that, which will mean I'll probably have to set this out further, or if I want to make separate tabs somewhere for the turn signals. Here's the layout for the mounting tabs that I want to make, and I'm going to use 1/8 inch thick by 1.5 inch wide steel flat bar. Here's one bracket, but before I try to duplicate it, I want to make sure that it fits as I intended it to. I've got plenty of clearance between the turn signal and the headlight bucket, so now let's look at it on the scooter. Looks pretty good to me. I do have probably about 3 inches of room between the back of this headlight bucket and the frame here, but I didn't want to push it back too far because I figured it would give me plenty of room depending on what kind of wires and such I had up here. I didn't want to cramp everything up in there by having the headlight bucket recessed as far as it could go. Both tabs are made and should be identical, so now I just need to get them mounted to these tubes. I'm happy with how this has turned out so far. Initially when I laid it out, I marked the centers of each tube and then I marked the distance I would need to go over from center to accommodate the width of the headlight housing. And then when I was putting it together, I realized it would be easier just to go ahead and weld the tabs on center, and I adjusted them after I got them welded on, adjusted meaning hit them with a hammer, and bent them a little bit outward, just enough to accommodate the width of the headlight because it wasn't really that far off, and that was a little easier to get together than the other way. And I was also thinking that it may tilt lean the turn signals back a little bit and might make it a little more visible from the side, but honestly I don't think it really made any difference there. Either way, I like the way it looks. I think now I'm going to go ahead and actually put the headlight in here and maybe test the headlight together with the signals and everything, and just make sure, like I did if you watched the video about the rear end, that all this stuff can be tied together and all the grounds being tied together, etc., doesn't create any sort of issues. I'm just using the truck battery, so I've got plenty of power for testing. I would have painted these tubes now, but it's raining and windy and just generally not a good time to do any paint work. So instead I'm going to take the forks off and see if I can stiffen those up a little bit. The oil height in the left fork was 140 millimeters, and I drained out about 70 milliliters of fork oil that came out very dark. And those seem like maybe it's a little low to me, so I'm curious to see what comes out of the right fork. But before I drain that one out, I'm going to go ahead and continue disassembling this because I'm going to change the fork seal. I'll only be replacing the actual fork seals, not the dust caps, mostly because the dust caps, the size of those, was hard to find, and they seem to be in really good shape, so I just cleaned them up. At this point, both forks have been cleaned, the seals have been replaced, and they're pretty much ready for oil and to put the caps back on. But I've got a chunk of aluminum here, and I'm going to try to use that to make a couple of spacers that will sit on top of the springs, between the springs and the caps, just to try and stiffen the shocks up a little more. If you're interested in trying something similar to stiffen up your front suspension, don't worry because you don't have a lathe. There are all kinds of ways to come up with a spacer. With a lot of forks, they're big enough that you can take a piece of PVC or a PVC cap and put that in there along with maybe a washer above and below it, just to kind of even out the load from the spring on the plastic pipe. You could actually just buy tubing or bar like this and cut it down. It doesn't have to be incredibly precise and super clean cuts for this. Just get it as smooth as you can reasonably, and that would work. There's all sorts of things you could do. Just make sure it's something that will actually hold up to the pressure between the spring and the cap there. You don't want something that shatters. So far I've only cut one 1-inch spacer. Before I cut the other one, I just want to make sure that this one isn't too difficult to get in place, because sometimes the really tall spacers make it very tough to compress the spring. Looks like that'll work, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the other one 1 inch as well. With both spacers completed, the only thing left is to add fork oil and to get the caps and the spacers on. But when I drained these, they both had a 140 millimeter fork oil height, and about 70 to 75 milliliters of fork oil came out of each one. When I put it back together, I want to go with a little higher fork oil height. I'm going to try about 120 millimeters and see how that does. I'll probably put about 85 milliliters in first and see if that's enough. And also, I'm going to be using 20 weight fork oil. This is just Drag Specialties, heavy, 20 weight. Same stuff that I use in one of my other scooters, and it works pretty well to stiffen it up over stock. So I'm hoping between a little higher fork oil height, a little heavier oil. I don't actually know what they put in their stock, but usually they don't use 20 weight. As well as the spacers, that should stiffen it up quite a bit because they were quite soft to begin with. While I'm setting up my fork oil height rig, I did want to tell you that I have a video up all about servicing the front shocks on scooters. So if you want to learn more about this process in detail, I'll put a link to that in the description. Okay, it looks like my guess of 85 milliliters is not enough to get the fork oil height where I wanted it. So I'm going to have to pour a little bit more in there. Okay, apparently I poured in much more than I realized because now I've got a fork oil height of about maybe 40 millimeters. But that's alright. Just use the syringe and try to pull that out of there. I did have a bigger syringe for this thing, and I think the plastic got brittle and cracked, and then I forgot to replace it. Sucked out all I can suck out, and the fork oil just touches the very bottom of this. So my height should now be set to 120 millimeters on that shock. I do want to check the steering head bearings that are in here sometime, but there's no point in me doing it right now because eventually I'll take this down to the frame and paint the frame. So when I get to there, putting it back together, then I'll go over that stuff. For right now, I think I'm going to focus on trying to find out how to mount my Trailtech Vapor. So I've just got to put a few things back together. The Vapor has two mounting holes on the back that are 40 millimeters apart on center. And this moped included a plate for the original gauges and the ignition switch that went right up here underneath of the handlebar mount. And I saved it initially because I thought that I could use it as an easy mount for the Vapor. Unfortunately, these two holes are too far apart and there's really nothing else, nowhere else that I could use or that I'd want to. So I guess this is just going to be a template for me to make it easier to make a bracket for it. The reason that I wanted to do a bit of assembly was because I wanted to make sure that if the Trailtech was right up here close to the handlebars, that I could easily read it, and I can, and I don't think it's going to be too difficult to press the buttons. So I'm going to go with a small bracket and try to place it right about there. Here's how it looks. Should be fairly clean. On the underside, there's enough room for the wires to pass through. The only thing that I don't really like right now is that these two bolts have a larger section that locate them in this plate and should locate them in this plate. Well, they work on the top plate now, but they're not deep enough to locate the whole assembly into this plate. And this is the same thickness as what came off of its stock. So I guess that's how it was when it came apart, but it just seems odd that they didn't make that deep enough to go through this hole and the hole in the plate. I loosened these up a little bit, and now you can see it can move all around in those holes when without the thickness of this plate, it would lock itself into one position there. Without the gauge plate in there, you can see that the handlebars and this plate are locked together very well, so there's really no movement. It seems to me that the gauge plate from the factory was an afterthought, and they actually kind of screwed up their original design that worked well. It shouldn't be necessary because my setup with the Trailtech should be very similar to the factory setup with a gauge plate. But I'm thinking I could make a washer or spacer basically with the inside diameter tight to this bolt and an outside diameter to about match that, and it should still help to lock it in place more like it was probably intended from the factory. Here are the steel spacers that I made. I made this area thick because these are way longer than they need to be, so it'll just save me some threading on of the lock nuts. I drilled these or bored these undersized a bit and then filed them so they're really tight. And they also fit very snug in there. Now this is just lightly snugged. You can still see there's a little bit of play. I can rock it around a bit, but I can't move the handlebars all around because all that stuff fits together so tightly. It's still raining, so I can't paint any of the stuff that I've made, but I've got new wheel bearings and seals, so I'm going to go ahead and get that together. I've checked the brake. It says minimum thickness 3 millimeters and it's 4 millimeters thick, so that should be good for a while. I'm going to go ahead and install the wheel now because I've got a magnet that needs to either install on the brake rotor or on the wheel somewhere for the Trailtech Vapor speedometer, and I'm not sure how I'm going to set that up, so I need to put the wheel on there so I can kind of look things over. The Trailtech kit that I got came with a magnetic bolt that's M8 by 1.25, which doesn't match the size of the bolts in this brake rotor, and it has a magnet in there that you can glue on or epoxy on. And it is this style. And this style just goes through a hole right in front of the sensor, and it's got these two lock nuts so you can adjust the depth and set the distance between the end of the sensor and the magnet on the wheel. I think the easiest thing for me to do is going to be to epoxy the magnet here between two of the brake bolts and then come up with a bracket that goes underneath of the axle or over the axle and positions this sensor here so that it can pick up that magnet. I'm going to try to make this out of 3/4 inch wide, 1/8 inch thick steel, just working on finishing up the hole for the axle right now. When I look through this hole, I'm looking directly down at a bolt. So I think as long as I epoxy a magnet on at the same distance off center as these bolts are, then I should be good for the sensor and the magnet alignment. I cleaned this section with mineral spirits, and maybe you can see I've marked it there for where the center should be for my magnet. And I'm going to go ahead and epoxy that on with JB Clear Weld. I've used JB Weld and JB Clear Weld before, both have worked just fine for me. The epoxy is dry now on the magnet, so I'm going to go ahead and install the wheel, make sure my bracket is set up properly for where the magnet is, and the weather has improved today. Humidity's a lot lower, so I'm hoping I can get this bracket as well as the other metal parts that I made painted today. Looks pretty good to me. Now I'm going to balance the front wheel and tire, and if you'd like some information on balancing wheels and tires for scooters and mopeds and motorcycles, I'll put a link in the description. That's as easy as I've ever had a wheel balance go. I tried 7 grams the first time and it actually worked, so I stuck 7 grams on there and it seems to be balanced. As you can see, I've still got to wrap up the headlight and turn signal wires and put them into one connector, but otherwise that stuff is pretty much done, so here's what it looks like. And since it's back on its own 2 feet, I've got to hop up here and find out how much different the suspension feels pushing down on it. Well, I didn't work any miracles with the front suspension, but it definitely feels better than it did. With that said, I'm going to wrap up this video, so please like it if you enjoyed it or found it helpful. Share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything in this project or my other videos. And as always, thank you for watching.